For showing or attending this month's March's speaker series with author Brian Castner. This is an event that we do every month. We talk about maritime history and things related to boats and the water. Specifically, Brian's going to be talking about his book, Disappointment River, and the Mackenzie expedition. And Brian retraced the steps, or the route of Mackenzie's expedition to the Arctic Circle. I'm going to hand it over to Brian, and he's going to talk about the book. And if anyone does have any questions, there will be an opportunity for questions at the end, so you can just hold those until the end. There will be an opportunity for those. Thank you everyone so much.
Yes, thank you for coming. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
We're switching mics. Okay, good. It's nice to get together again. We were talking before that I launched a book during the pandemic, and no talks or tours or meeting people or meeting readers, and I don't recommend that at all. So it's nice. Thank you for coming out. You could be doing a lot of things tonight, and I appreciate you wanting to spend some time talking about this and my book and such. Just a little bit about me. I grew up in Buffalo. I grew up in Chipewyan. I went into the military. I did a variety of other things before I came back. My first book was called The Long Walk. I was a bomb tech, explosive ordnance disposal technician, and that book came out. I went to Iraq and Afghanistan places, and I wrote a book about that experience. And coming home, I was really fortunate that book did well, and I got a chance to write about more things having to do with bombs. I wrote a book called All the Ways We Kill and Die, which is about a buddy of mine that died in Afghanistan. I wrote magazine stories about bombs. I did a story on the Boston Marathon bombing for Wired magazine. I did bombs, and eventually my wife said, "When are you going to write about something else?" So I did, because I also love canoeing, and I love the outdoors. And really what happened is I had an errant Google search. One of the main questions you always get is, how do you come up with ideas for books? And I completely stumbled upon this. I Googled something totally different, and I stumbled upon this story. So I'm going to read very, very briefly from the prologue of the book, just 2 pages, to give you a sense of the scene and of this guy Alexander Mackenzie and what we're going to be talking about today. So this is the prologue. The river was liquid glass, a cloud mirror that rolled beneath my canoe and made me dizzy, as if I might stumble and fall down into the heavens. And in the horizon, the silvery sky and water fused as one. We had been paddling for 2 days, and the river was so wide that the far bank appeared to be little more than a slight film of green. Reeds filled our shore, black ducks and seagulls, and a steady succession of bald eagles feeding on both. Behind us, tumbling lake storms, and ahead, just a rumor of current. This river, the many nations of Dene, the indigenous people in the middle and upper basin, they know it as the Det Cho. The Gwich'agwichin in the lower interior bush, they call it the I still can't pronounce it, Nadwichunjik. The Inuvialuit, the western Inuit at the river's end in the Arctic, they call it the Kukpak. All the names are a variation on the same theme, the Big River, and for good reason. It's the second longest in North America. The island that plugs the river's upper mouth is larger than 5 Manhattans. Everything about the Det Cho is enormous. And yet, I intended to canoe every drop of it, all 1,100 miles. I'm a fairly serious river guide, but never before had I undertaken a self-supported trip of this magnitude, and the scale of the journey weighed heavily. We paddled an 18.5-foot sea clipper canoe, wide and steady as the days, designed to track through whitecaps and swallow hundreds of pounds of gear. I had spent half a year researching, purchasing, testing, sorting, packing, and repacking that gear. an Everest-rated tent, solar paddles and satellite link, a handcrafted curved splitting axe from Maine, 90 freeze-dried dinners from Quebec, plus apples, mandarins, bagels, peanut butter, chocolate, oatmeal tea, chunk honey, and 15 pounds of pemmican. All that and more stuffed in waterproof barrels or lashed to the boat so a rogue wave couldn't end our trip. That morning, as we broke our first camp on the sandy shore of Great Slave Lake, I felt smothered by the scale of the job ahead of us, the labor required, the intense summer heat, the size of the river. It had taken 2 days of travel just to reach the starting line, weeks and weeks yet to go to find the end. All day, the shore ground by reluctantly, grueling progress in the hazy shimmer, but then, unexpectedly and with great relief, a breeze stirred behind us. How did a breeze come out of the east, and the watery mirror shattered as wavelets formed around us? I unfolded the small sail we had brought for just such an unlikely development, clipped it to a metal bar at the nose of the boat, and when a gust caught us, I felt it tug hard against my line, and we surged forward, surfing on and over the rising waves, making real headway for the first time. We paddled with ease, and the wind filled our sail, and the current increased as the river coalesced, and so by the end of that day, I felt it for the first time. The optimism, the promise, felt by the men and women who attempted the first recorded descent of this river, and whose path, in fact, I was following. For centuries, Europeans had been searching for a water route through North America. This mystical passage was known by many names: the Strait of Annan, the River Oregon, the Mer de West. Anyone who found it, mapped it, returned alive to tell the world would solve the greatest geographic mystery of the day and secure the riches and fame commensurate with such an achievement. Thousands of sailors and soldiers had tried and failed over the years, but none had explored the Dead Show, not until a party of fur traders and their indigenous partners launched an expedition in 1789. This river, its channel so wide and flat, the size of 100 Champs-Élysées, was the last best hope of finding a shipping lane through the continent. Midnight approached, and the sun was just starting to curve towards the orange horizon. My face flushed in its glow. The wind drove us on, the river pulled us ever west, and I understood then, in that moment, why those explorers really did believe that in the Dead Show, they had finally found a route to China, the fabled Northwest Passage. So, I don't know about you. I read the audiobook, so if you want 12 hours, you can probably get it on Audible. That's what I would say. So I don't know about you, but my fourth grade teacher lied to me. And because my fourth grade teacher told me that Lewis and Clark led the first expedition across North America. And that's wrong. It wasn't. It was this guy. And he led the first recorded crossing, and I say recorded, just allowing for an indigenous crossing or another one unrecorded. But his name is Alexander Mackenzie. He was born in 1762 in Stornoway on the Isle of Lewis in far northern Scotland. And he was a refugee to America. He was fleeing economic downturn in Scotland. It was emptying out. There's a lot of poverty. And he landed in New York City in 1775, just as the revolution was kicking off. And when his family fled to the Mohawk River Valley in upstate New York, and then eventually went to Montreal, and when Mackenzie made his crossing across North America in 1793, Meriwether Lewis was just a schoolboy, and Sacagawea wasn't even born yet. So, but that was only Mackenzie's second expedition. His first great expedition was 1789, and he was looking for the Northwest Passage, except he ended up in the Arctic instead. So Mackenzie was exploring in the time of the voyageurs. And they were like the bearded Arctic hipsters of their day. That's not quite right. I mean, they had like very carefully groomed mustaches, but they were more like workhorses. I talked to one researcher at the University of York who described them as like truckers, like they were driving semis across the continent essentially. Because they're what made the fur trade work. So let me just explain the fur trade a little bit. Beaver fur, and I'll explain more about that why in a second, but it was extremely valuable. And the way it would work is that all of the trade was centered in London. And so you would have these goods. You would have, I don't know, pots and gunpowder and flour and textiles and all these things that would start in England. It would get shipped to North America. It might end up in New York City, it might end up in Montreal, and then it had to be carried inland by voyageurs, taken to a trading post where those traders, bourgeois, would trade goods with the local indigenous people, trade for all those things, get the furs, and then transfer it all back to Montreal, carry it back in these boats, ship it all back to London, and then eventually the pay would come back to Montreal. And so it could be a 2 or 3 year process. If you were a trader in Montreal, before you first put money down, putting your order in for these trade goods from London, before you finally saw your money and paid back. And a lot of those furs, they were being, like, the hats were very popular in London, they were popular in continental Europe, but they're also very popular in China. So after all of that transfer, it then had to go all the way around the southern tip of South America and to China. And so the search for the Northwest Passage, which I'll get into in a second, was really a way to shortcut that. Is there a way that we could get directly to China? But in any case, so that's the point of the fur trading. They use these enormous canoes. The small canoes were 18 feet. The big canoes like these, the master canoes, were 30 feet. They were birch bark canoes. And I'm going to do a small segue for a second, just kind of like an interesting crossroads of history kind of thing. We really, because this is a group that loves to build canoes and loves to build boats, we know how birch bark canoes are built, really because of the work of just a few people, one of which is a guy named Tappan Adney is kind of a crazy old coot who, long story, but ended up spending a lot of time with the Maliseet people in the Maritimes in Canada, and was just fascinated by their language and by how they built birch bark canoes and wrote it all down. And John McPhee wrote an incredible book about the history of the birch bark canoe and cites Tappan Adney as essentially the reason why we know all of this stuff. Tappan Adney is an extremely obscure name. I know him for 2 reasons. One is he was important, obviously, for this book. He was also happened to be a reporter for Harper's Magazine and wrote the definitive story of the Klondike Gold Rush. I also wrote a book on the Klondike Gold Rush, which came out like 2 years ago. So I don't know. Someday we can talk about the Klondike, but like Tappan Adney like comes back for me, in multiple ways. It's kind of an odd coincidence. So these voyageurs would paddle 18 hours a day. They had synchronized strokes, 1 per second, 60 strokes a minute. They could make 100 miles a day when they were really moving. They would run the portages with the way that they packed the various, they would call them pieces, but like 45-pound sections on tump lines, minimum of 2. So they would have 90 pounds on their back, running back and forth, moving the pieces, which is how they could move 100 miles a day. Absolutely incredible. So they would spend the spring and the fall doing that, and then they would spend the winter and summer sleeping, essentially. So I'm not kidding. Lay around the fur trading post and drink and not too much else. So Mackenzie was a member of the Northwest Company, which was a business cabal in Montreal. It was essentially the main rival to the Hudson's Bay Company, which you might have heard of. And the rule for hundreds of years, from Cartier and Champlain and all those guys, in the 1500s and the 1600s, is that the best furs always lay to the north and west. So I said that these beaver furs were just so valuable. The most valuable beaver fur they would call the Coster Gras, and that was the thickest fur at winter's height. So you had to kill the beavers in their burrows at the height of winter when they had the maximum fur. And so that means obviously cold temperatures, heavy snow, so it means that the further west you go and the further north you go, the better and better the furs got. And so the Northwest Company, they built this series of posts, always going north and west, but they were doing it essentially into a blank spot in the map. So, again, sorry that you can get the basic idea, even if our I'm sorry that it's not exactly focused, I guess. But, so I find this map fascinating because it's from 1780. It's not that old of a map. Like, the revolution was going on, and this is how much people knew about, or thought they, like, it was speculative of what was in various parts of North America. So let me just point out a few things. One is the Sea of the West, which is essentially like an elongated San Francisco Bay, right? It comes in from California. That's the Sea of the West. And then you also have the Strait of Annan, which you can't read, but kind of connects there up into Hudson's Bay. And these straits are required to make a Northwest Passage. And today we understand the Northwest Passage as being a way around Canada, but at the time it was covered in ice, and so speculative geographers thought there must be a way through the continent. Speculative geography, like what is this? That's what the term, right? So why were they so sure of that? So this comes from the balanced Earth theory, which is from the ancient Greeks and Aristotle, which basically held that the Earth must have symmetrical forms in the east and western continents and the north and southern hemispheres, because if the Earth was not balanced, it would be out of whack and it would like fall over or wouldn't spin correctly and everything else. So basically everything that was in the northern hemisphere had to be in the south and the east and the west. And so for a long time they speculated that there was a Terra Australis that must be in the south to offset what was in the north, and you know what, they were right? So they like, I mean, eventually Australia was, quote, discovered, by Europeans. So because there was a southern way around South America, there must be a northern way around North America. They just hadn't found it yet. And all of their maps were terrible, except for one guy. And that one guy is named Peter Pond. And this was his map of what he had sketched out. So real quickly about Peter Pond. He's fascinating. He's born in Connecticut. He serves in the French and Indian Wars. He's here at the seizure of Fort Niagara in 1759. Fights on the battlefield. Actually, as a veteran myself, I think it's kind of interesting that a lot of the fur traders in the 1770s and 1780s are all veterans of the French and Indian War, and in fact, often fought on different sides of it, and then would get into duels and fights at the fur trading posts, like up in the north, what we call now the Northwest Territory. Anyway, so Peter Pond is the first white man to cross the Medu Portage into the Arctic Basin. And so where is that? So I'm gonna try to point. I don't have a laser pointer. Hold on a second. So like, I don't know, Lake Superior is like in the bottom corner. And then if you can kind of imagine going up to Lake Winnipeg, follow it up, and then follow it up again, eventually you're going to get to Great Slave Lake up at the very top. He was the one that had mapped out a whole bunch of that, and he was convinced, if you kind of go to the left side of the map, you can't read it, but there's a blob, you can kind of tell what is the Rocky Mountains there, right? And at the top of the Rocky Mountains, he has Great Slave Lake, which is true, but then he also has basically the coast of Alaska. So Captain Cook had just mapped the west coast of what's now the United States, British Columbia, up to Alaska, had just mapped the Cook Inlet, which is where Anchorage is, had just identified that tons of fresh water and big pieces of timber coming out of the Cook Inlet. He didn't go any further. And he said there must be an absolutely massive river here coming out. Now, Peter Pond knew what latitude he was at and longitude, basically, and he knew he was far enough north. And he said, I have a massive river leaving the west of Great Slave Lake. There is a massive river dumping into what's now Alaska and the Cook Inlet. They must be the same river. In fact, and he did a little math, he did his math wrong, and he said, actually, there's only like a 2 or 3 day journey between Great Slave Lake and that Cook Inlet. He knew he was at high altitude, essentially. He knew that there must be a difference. So you can't read it, but you can see how he kind of drew a river between Great Slave Lake and the West Coast. What he wrote there was the greatest waterfall in the world. That it must be like some 1,500-foot waterfall. That he just decided, speculative geography again, must be there. And so Cook was convinced, or I'm sorry, Peter Pond was convinced that between Cook's information and his own map, that he had solved the 300-year-old mystery, and that all that needed to be done was to confirm it. There was a problem though. Pond was one of those people that held a grudge from the French and Indian War, and was one of those people that was known to kill his business partners, at least for trading posts. So he's replaced in 1787 by Mackenzie. At the time, Pond was almost 50 years old. Old man, kick him out, time is done. Mackenzie was 25, he was the up-and-comer, and replaced him. So how did Mackenzie get to be the up-and-comer? Strangely enough, the story starts again at the French and Indian War. So this is a very famous painting, the Death of General Wolfe, which depicts the Plains of Abraham, which is outside of Quebec City. And it was basically ended the French and Indian War. And the guy in green, and General Wolfe is dying, but the guy in green on the left is the one we care about. His name is Sir William Johnson. And he was known, he had a lot of indigenous allies. The Mohawk called him one who doesn't much. And before and after the French and Indian War, Sir William Johnson founds Johnson Hall, which is now Johnstown, New York, on the Mohawk River Valley. And William Johnson got rich and famous by partnering with the Mohawk chief Hendrick. This is Hendrick. And so when Alexander Mackenzie's family lands in New York City and the revolution is starting, it was a bad time to be a teenage boy in New York City. You're going to be pressed in the Navy or die in the crossfire or something else. His family flees up into the Mohawk Valley, and they flee to Johnson Hall, which is where the Mohawk are, and which is where Sir William Johnson is. William Johnson's just died, actually, so it's John Johnson, his son, is now in charge of Johnson Hall. And Mackenzie's father becomes a bannerman for John Johnson, and they fight on the other side in the Revolution. They fight for the British. So Mackenzie's father dies in the Revolutionary War, not in battle. He dies of cholera at a camp up in the Thousand Islands. But John Johnson takes care of Alexander Mackenzie, being the son of one of his lieutenants, his right-hand man. As it's clear that the Americans are winning the revolution and the British are fleeing to Canada, John Johnson takes Mackenzie with, sets him up, he's 16 years old, sets him up in the fur trade as an apprentice, keeping a book, a ledger like Bob Cratchit would in Christmas Carol. All he's doing is keeping the tally of the fur trade, and basically he learns the trade, and that's how he gets started. Mackenzie's first trip, Alexander Mackenzie's first trip outside Montreal is to Fort Detroit, and he goes when he's 22 in 1784. And this is when he came past Buffalo. So this is, again, another map from the time. You can see Ontario area, the Great Lakes, obviously. So if you were headed to the interior of the Northwest, you would take the Ottawa River, which connects into Lake Huron. You go through up into Superior, and Grand Portage in Minnesota is kind of the route where you go. I'll show that on the map later. That's if you're doing the, kind of the lower, closer fur trading outposts like Fort Detroit in 1784. Then you come down the St. Lawrence, or actually up the St. Lawrence, I guess, from Montreal into Lake Ontario. You skirt the north shore of Lake Ontario. You come up the Niagara River, past Fort Niagara. You take you go around Niagara Falls in the traditional route, Portage Road. It's called that for a reason. You come around, and then they do the north shore of, get in a proper ship at that point, get it on the north shore of Lake Erie, and go to Detroit. So we don't have a record of what Mackenzie was thinking when he came through here. It was kind of neat, though. I live on Grand Island, to essentially put my boat in the water and paddle the route from my own home. It's kind of an interesting part of this. Detroit, it should be said at the time, was essentially lawless. I don't know, if it is now too, but it was, I mean that literally. So in 1784, it was still a British garrison. The British had lost the revolution, but they hadn't left yet. Most of the residents were French or indigenous. There's no real government oversight. And I think it's important to remember that as Mackenzie did this trip, like obviously there was lots of indigenous people that lived where he was going and had for many years. Many of them, though, had been pushed out or upset not living in traditional lands. They had been moved because of fighting with the French and the British. The land he was moving through was claimed by the Spanish, it was claimed by the Hudson Bay Company, it was claimed by the British, parts of it were claimed by what was going to eventually be the United States. But it was essentially like, it was all those things and it was none of those things. So he was really moving into some ways, like it was unmapped and very loosely held. So just to go back to this, so he goes through Lake Winnipeg, the Saskatchewan River. He works his way further and further up to a place on Lake Athabasca, which is Peter Pond calls the Old Establishment, and then eventually, I'll let you read in the book about the murder and why Peter Pond gets kicked out, but Mackenzie is the one who's going to do the trip. Something else that I think is kind of interesting that's worth saying just because of our geography that I didn't realize until I did this trip is we know about the Great Lakes. I guess might know about Lake Winnipeg. I did not realize the geography of why that existed and why they really used these rivers and lakes as the mechanism that they did, and just how important the geology is to this. So if you think about, if you ever seen like at a parking lot, where the parking lot hits the grass, and there's always puddles there because the parking lot's really hard and the water has to spill off, and you get all these puddles in the grass. That's essentially the Canadian Shield and all of the mud surrounding the Canadian Shield. So Lake Ontario, Lake Huron, Lake Superior, Lake Winnipeg, Athabasca, Great Slave Lake, all of them up along this route and all of the rivers that connect them, they're essentially the mud puddles on the side of the Canadian Shield. And if it weren't for that geology, like none of this fur trade would be able to exist. None of this series of paddling and carrying canoes from one pond and one river to exist. It's like a very unique thing. So in the summer of 1789, 13 people in 3 canoes leave Fort Chipewyan on Lake Athabasca. And let me just say something about the crew. So Mackenzie's in charge. His partner is Auginaw. Now, Auginaw deserves, I think, to be at least as famous as Sacagawea and any other indigenous partner in any story of exploration in North America. Auginaw is really the great explorer of the 18th century, at least when it comes to North America. He takes Samuel Hearne on the Coppermine River up through the Arctic. He guides Mackenzie on this trip on what's eventually called the Mackenzie River. He's the great trading chief. I think one of the things I'm proudest about in this book is I think I've written as much about Auginaw as any writer or historian has been able to in drawing all those threads together and basically all of the available historic information that we have on him. I don't think there's been a focus for. I think he's fascinating. And it's worth saying also that Auginaw had not been to these places either. So when they're doing this trip together, it's new for Auginaw in addition to Mackenzie. Mackenzie has 4 voyageurs with him to paddle. He also has a German clerk who was a Hessian mercenary who fought in the Revolutionary War and then deserted. And then Auginaw brings 2 hunters, one of which is his younger brother. And then Auginaw also brings 2 of his wives, and 2 of the voyageurs bring their wives. And this isn't for company, and I'm sorry to say it's also not about equality. It's ruthless humanitarianism because it's really about self-sufficiency and survival. The Chipewyan people really divide all tasks up in a very gendered way. The hunters will paddle sometimes more than 100 miles a day, going back and forth from the main body out to kill ducks or come back, or out to kill something and come back. They can't hunt and cook. The women would cook and camp Like everybody had a job, nobody did each other's job. So, and actually Alguina was, he was adamant about this. He had taken white people around the Arctic before, and he said that like in a lot of those trips had failed, people had starved to death, et cetera, et cetera. And he said, the problem is you didn't bring any women on your trip. We need everybody here so everybody can do their jobs. So that's where they go. Let me, you can, sure, I'll back up. So this is the map as we know it now, of course, right? And you can see those string of lakes that go up the Canadian Shield. Great Slave Lake, well, Great Bear Lake is the one at the very, very top. Next one down is Great Slave Lake. And the Mackenzie River runs out of Great Slave Lake and runs west, and for a while does exactly what Pond and Mackenzie thought it was going to do. The problem is they didn't know the Rocky Mountains were in the way. And once the river hits the Rockies, it makes a big right turn, and it doesn't go to the Pacific, it goes to the Arctic. I decided that I was going to recreate the trip, and I'll say in a second why. So it takes Mackenzie and his crew 40 days to reach the ocean, but it's the wrong ocean, obviously. And so when he gets to the end, it's covered in pack ice, which is why he eventually calls it the River Disappointment. Mackenzie, he makes that second trip that I said up the Peace River in 1793, and this is the one where he actually successfully crosses the continent, but it's a horrible journey. There's no way to recreate it. I wasn't going to recreate it. It definitely was not a business venture. Remember, the whole point was to get furs to China. There was no way to do it across the Canadian Rockies. And so when Mackenzie gets back from that second trip, he writes a letter to the Governor General, and he says, though I was disappointed, my expedition proved without a doubt that there is not a Northwest Passage below this latitude, and I believe it will generally be allowed that no passage is practicable, in a higher latitude, the sea being eternally covered in ice. And when I read his description, that's what made me want to do the journey, because not to give away the end of the book, I wasn't going to see ice at the end. We've had hundreds of years of climate change since. And so I wanted to be able to see it and do something essentially that Mackenzie was not able to do. So I did not paddle from Montreal or from here. I drove. I did try to drive essentially as much of the route as you can do by road. It's not really possible through northern Saskatchewan to Manitoba. There's not, the roads go north-south to like mining camps. They don't go east-west. You can't really get across. So eventually you have to get to Alberta and drive north. And I went to a place called Hay River, and then I paddled the rest of the way, which is, from there I paddled the rest, which is the Mackenzie River, what we now call it. So some practicalities. So here's my gear. Some of it was useless. Some of it got stolen in the first few days. All of the cooking fuel and my stove got stolen. I ended up getting, fortunately, it wasn't too long into the trip, I'll let you read about why, but I got a BioLite stove that burns sticks and moss and lichen and everything else. I still use that as my main stove. I never have to carry or worry about fuel ever again. It takes twice as long to cook dinner, but not having to worry about fuel makes it worth it. I love the BioLite stove. So we packed a whole bunch of stuff. The two most important things that people want to know about are your tent and your canoe. I got a Hilleberg tent. I paid extra. It was a tent that they use at base camp on Everest. I highly recommend. We had incredible winds on the river, and that tent held up just fine. The Sea Clipper we rented, believe it or not, in Hay River. It was brand spanking new when we rented it. It was not new when we were done with it. Having said that, for the amount that we paid to rent it, you could have bought a new one. So I guess I don't feel too bad. It was an excellent canoe. The way that we did it is we had one canoe, but I had 4 friends, and I could take an entire summer off because I was a writer writing a book, and my friends could not take a summer off. So they each did like 2-week stints with me. So like Dave Chrissinger, who's the big guy at the back, he did the first 2 weeks with me, and then we got to a certain point, and we would change out. There are like very small indigenous towns of like 400, 500 that have airstrips. So they could fly in and out. We kind of had to time the logistics, but buddies would swap out, and then we would keep going. So it's like a relay race. I was the baton. They just passed me off. They all did a couple weeks. We took this photo together because it was the only time, like none of them had ever met. We got together at a Christmas party, just so they could meet. Like I said, I was a bomb tech before, so Landon on the far right and Senny on the far left, they're both bomb techs. I knew I could rely on them. David is a big Wisconsin guy who played football and doesn't complain much, so I knew he would be good. Jeremy, with the bald head and the exquisite beard, is another story. God bless him. I love Jeremy. So, like I said, my first book, I was fortunate. It did pretty well. It became an opera that's actually been performed all over. Jeremy is the composer of that opera. I did not discover until the first night that he had never slept in a tent and had never pooped in the woods. So, the poor guy got diarrhea. He got plenty of practice. By the end of it, he toughed it out. We did fine. It was good. Before the journey, the very beginning, I first went out with the paddle club in Fort Smith on the Slave River. So one reason that Mackenzie's trip took 40 days there and back. My trip took 40 days. We did slightly different trips. One thing Mackenzie did was the Slave. I didn't do the Slave because it's some of the biggest whitewater in North America. So it is, the paddle club took me out, I don't know, like I'm a decent whitewater canoeer, yard sail. They rescued me about 3 times. The thing about the Slave River is, it's like it's class 4-5, but it is class 4-5 a mile or 2 wide. So it's like a ski resort. Like you pull out into the river, and then the guys would be like, do you want the blue? Do you want the green? Do you want the double black diamond? And you would like plan the route, because you could skirt things, whatever else. There's just so many lines on that river. There's quote 4 rapids. One of them is named the Rapids of the Drowned. Some of Mackenzie's voyageurs had been on the trip where the voyageurs died in the naming of the Rapids of the Drowned. So like the Mackenzie expedition went on this trip, like had a personal connection to that loss. But yeah, we did not do the Rapids of the Drowned, but it was still a mess. It was just absolutely whitewater like I had never seen. So that we scouted. We didn't do that in the canoe, obviously. We did the canoe from Hay River, Great Slave Lake. This is the Camsell Bend, which is one of the prettiest parts of the river. So the river just streams to the Rockies and then makes that right. The Camsell Bend is where it makes that right turn. It's worth saying that Mackenzie didn't notice that he had made a right turn, which might sound surprising. Like how could he not know? And there's a couple reasons why. One is he was moving really fast, and he had thunderstorms, and it was constantly gray, so he couldn't see the sun. The main reason was he had a compass, but he did not understand the difference between magnetic north and true north, and he especially didn't understand that at a certain point, magnetic north was sitting to his east and not ahead, that he was so far north that it was skewed. So he kept thinking he was going west, but every time he was going west, he was going northwest, and every time he was going northwest, he was going north. It's like it was tugging. So he didn't really discover until the very end that he was in the wrong place, which is, I don't know, one of the things that's actually a little bit heartbreaking about his journals. Like, when he discovers he's in the wrong place, it's truly a discovery. I have trouble articulating exactly how big the Mackenzie River is, the dead show. I mean, in many places you can't see the other side. The current is 12 to 15 miles an hour in some places. I had a GPS. There was one point where on my GPS tracker it was telling me how fast we were going. Between the wind at our backs, the sail up, and the current, like we were going more than 20 miles an hour, which is actually too fast because you're out of control. And we were surfing the waves, and like we had to get off the river because the wind, even at our backs, the wind was too strong. But I mean, there's barge traffic on the Mackenzie, so like that is a full, like ocean-going container ship transiting. I've got Jeremy is sleeping; he's taking a nap. We're on an island in the river, and it had passed us, and we're watching it go. The other thing that everybody asks when you go that far north is about bears and bugs. So this is a bear print that, fortunately, I was not there when it happened. So there's every kind of bear up there, black, brown, and polar. A lot of our trip was, we never had a bear encounter, but that's because of a lot of our planning of our trip was really based around avoiding bears. So it's not like you know, in the Adirondacks, I always, you know, I hang my food or I put it off to the side or whatever else. You take like a number of other precautions. It's not just having bear spray and bear bangers, but one of the things you do is you never eat where you sleep. So you stop for dinner, you eat, and then you pack everything back up and go for another hour or two. So the smell of the cooking is never anywhere that you're sleeping. There's a lot that you can do to avoid. There are a lot of wolves and a lot of muskox and a lot of bear and everything else, but we never had a personal encounter. The polar bears are only at the very end. It was the wrong season for them. There was not ice around. I wasn't exactly worried, but the problem is polar bears aren't deterred. Polar bears will hunt you. So that was honestly our main concern, but we were up there only for a very short period of time. So that's the bears. The other thing is the bugs. The bugs are like nothing else. Who's ever done bulldogs? Who's ever had the bulldog experience? Nobody. Okay, so like there's mosquitoes, right? And then there's black flies, and then there's deer flies, and then there's bulldogs. And the bulldogs start like northern Manitoba, and they're about as big around as your thumb, and they don't sting, and they don't bite, they like chew. They land and they eat at places they've landed and eaten before. So if you have like a sore, they just keep coming back to that place to keep eating. And when you hit them, they don't die. So if you hit them, they'll like fly away. So you have to hit and smear if you want to like actually get rid of one. The bulldogs are like nothing else. So, I mean, there's more than bears and bugs. There's also lots of Dene people and Inuvialuit people that still live up there. I say still, like, as many of those indigenous people live up there now as lived during Mackenzie's time. It's about 10,000 in the valley. Most of them are in Inuvik, which is at the very end, which is a resource extraction, mining, natural gas facility, like, you know, company town. But there are Fort Good Hope and Fort Simpson and Tuktoyaktuk and a number of these other places. Like, it's about 400 to 800 mostly indigenous people. The 3 white people in town will be, you know, the priest, the store manager of the northern store, and the cop, the RCMP. But this was Wilfred Jackson, who's one of the Saatu Dene elders in Fort Good Hope. Let us stay at his place for 2 days, fed us the muskox that he had in the freezer outside. Just like an extremely generous man that, like, all you had to do was like pull up in the canoe and get out. And you didn't have to explain anything. Like, the town would show up and then like take you in. It was amazing. So our final destination was Gary Island. It was the place that Mackenzie called Whale Island. It's one of the very, very last islands out in the delta. The delta of the Mackenzie River, is one of these great deltas of the world, kind of like the Mississippi and the Niger River and those kind of places. The last bit of it is a 5-mile open water crossing to Gary Island. We had the weather, we had like the hourly weather. It was a little bit like making, trying to summit a peak. Like our weather window is this. This is when the winds will be right. This is when it's safe to do it. The weather report was wrong and ended up sleeting on us. I'll let you read about whether we made it and how we made it. Obviously, we lived through it. I would not like to ever do that paddle ever again. I'll say that. So I have one final thought, and then we can do questions, as Eddie said. And that's that. I named the book Disappointment River, not to discourage you from reading it, but because it epitomized how Mackenzie himself thought of the experience. He died in 1820. He died thinking he was a failure. He got done with that second trip in 1793, came back to Montreal, and essentially drank himself to death for the rest of his life. In reality, though, it's not that he failed, it's that he was 200 years too early. Because he got to the end, he got to Whale Island and saw nothing but ice. I got to Whale Island, what's now Gary Island, and, well, it was cold and sleeting, but it was open. So my question for you, kind of like a last rumination, is how would the history of our continent be different if Mackenzie had seen open water rather than ice? And Lewis and Clark are famous because America followed them on the Oregon Trail, right? Like it wasn't just that they had done that trip, it's that thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people eventually followed. If Mackenzie had seen open water, and if the fur trade had gone that direction, would Canada have had a northern Mackenzie Trail, like the Oregon Trail? Hugh MacLennan was a novelist, Canadian novelist. He traveled the Mackenzie River by barge in 1961, and he predicted that in 100 years, 2061, which is not that far away now, that 2 million people would call the area home, and that it would be full of universities and hospitals, et cetera, et cetera. Like I said, now it's still at 10,000, the same number as Mackenzie's journeys. And so I guess my closing thought is that some of these ideas, like the Northwest Passage, it's not just the idea, it's also a matter of time. So thank you very much for your attention. I think we're doing questions now. I don't want to keep you from a beer, but we can do a mix.
How did you get back home?
So that ended up turning out into its own adventure. So the current, even out to Gary Island, is insane. So we had made plans for a hunting guide, fishing guide to pick us up. Basically, when we got out there, I was going to send him a satellite message to come and get us. The weather ended up turning. We spent more time on Gary Island than we wanted to, whatever. He came and got us. What I had done, though, is I had put my truck on a barge in Hay River to barge all the way down to Inuvik, so that way I could drive the Dempster Highway home. The Dempster Highway is supposed to be one of these amazing highways in the world. It crosses, Northwest Territory, Yukon Territory, down into BC. Incredible highway. I get to Inuvik and my truck's not there. I call the barge company. My truck has not even left Hay River. Okay? Because there were such high winds on Great Slave Lake, the barges, there was a wreck, like a barge had been thrown up on rocks. All of the tugboats in the area were rescuing the wrecked barge. None of the tugboats could push my barge. My truck is still there. And so I said, why don't you keep it there? And I am gonna fly from Inuvik down to Hay River with as much of my gear as I could take with.
How did Mackenzie get back?
Mackenzie paddled. His trip took 3 times as long back as it did on the way out, because the current. Eventually the current gives up, right, in the delta especially. But the problem is, on the way up you have the north wind. At least he had the north wind at his back, but in a lot of those sections, they didn't paddle it, they lined it instead of, attaching a rope to the end of the canoe and like walking it on shore, because it's impossible to paddle large parts of it upstream. Yes, ma'am.
Lake, how did its name?
So the Great Slave Lake is named after the Slavey people, and this is one of those cases where the Slavey are an indigenous nation, but they didn't name themselves. They were called the Slavey by other tribes who named them that because they said they were good slaves. It's kind of like how, the Sioux, that's not their name for themselves. It's the name that other nations gave them, often derogatory terms. So, yeah, Great Slave Lake is named after a nation. There's talk about, like in many things, there's talk of renaming it. I have not kept track recently about how far along that is. Yes? Oh, you got your list, man.
Oh, yeah. Just in case no one else has any questions, I have a bunch. Have you gone on any trips since your Dacho trip? And are there any places you particularly like paddling either before this trip or after?
For the Klondike book, it's not a river trip, but we hiked the Chilkoot Trail, which is from, it's back in Alaska, it's up north. It's from like Skagway, Dyea, which if you've been on an Alaskan cruise is one of the places the cruise ships put in. Like the Chilkoot goes up and over the pass and then down to the Yukon River, which is the old traditional Klondike Gold Rush route. We were talking about this a little bit before about various paddle clubs. I'm a member of, I paddle with Zor Valley Paddle Club on Cattaraugus Creek. I'm a raft guide there, and used to raft guide in Letchworth and other stuff. But like that's like my paddling community. So a bunch of us did the Grand Canyon in 21 during COVID, which if you've not paddled the Grand Canyon, it really, it's everything that you've heard.
In a dory?
Not in a dory, although we were in a raft, but there was a guy with us that was like, we joined up with a trip through lava, and that guy was like in an old dory that he had like reconstructed himself and had done the trip like 15 times, and like, I don't get gaga for boats. I got gaga for this boat in that rapid. It was like a thing of beauty. It's incredible. Follow-up dory questions? I know if you're all dory.
Oh yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so really like how you're talking about the indigenous cultures and people that you've encountered. And as we are building the site of the Chief, it's frontmost in our minds, especially talking about the bicentennial voyage that we're doing. How did your views of indigenous people, Native Americans, change along the way, and did it?
Yeah, it absolutely, I changed. I'm not even sure where to start that question. I have a lot of, I have an adopted son who's indigenous. That's a long story I won't get into, until we're drinking beers at the bar or something. So I have, within our family, it's like things we've been, it's obviously it's not a new concept. Having said that, in the time that I was writing this, within the writing community and publishing community and in the general world, there's a lot more sensitivity to the idea of appropriating people's stories. Am I the one to tell this story? What do I need to learn before I tell this story? Being a white guy telling traditional oral history of the Dene or the Gwich'in or the whatever people, I tried to study before the trip with reporters. I've been a freelance journalist too, reporters that had worked in the Canadian North of what do I need to do? I don't want to make an ass out of myself. I don't want to be a jerk. I want to do a good job. Help me do a good job. And there were some good tips on how to do that and how to have those interactions. But I did try to lean into not appropriating the stories, but honoring the stories and finding as much opportunity as I could to give voice to the stories and not just tell Mackenzie's version of everything. Like you could tell the story completely from his perspective, but every one of these nations has a story about Mackenzie. They remember the trip. They remember, there's oral histories about it. There's all this history of like I'm trying to make the story, to make it the best story it can be, to tell as many different parts of it as I possibly can. And I think like one example of that is the Gwich'in people in their oral history talk about how there's two sets of history, that there was circular history, basically the natural state of things or the way things had been forever was a natural history where you have the seasons, there's no beginning and there's no end, there's a time for everything, there's the time we hunt, there's the time we fish, there's the time of winter, we go out to the land, we come back from the land. Like they had a very circular vision of time until Mackenzie's party arrived, and that's the time history changed from circular to linear. And from that moment on, time moved forward. And it changed the way of thinking of the nation. So I want to be able to like represent that. It's fascinating, right? So, but I also don't want to steal that story. I want to incorporate it in the most respectful, comprehensive way that I can. And I guess it came up as well in the Stampede book, because, I mean, not to talk about a different book that I'm not talking about, but who discovered the gold in the Klondike is a matter of disagreement. And long story short, the white folks stole it from Skookum Jim, who was a Tagish person, who was probably the one that actually discovered the gold. So like, I don't know, it's something I try to think about. I'm not sure I do it well, but I'm trying to do it better. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I think it's a much longer conversation, but yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Could you elaborate a little more on how Portage Road got its name, and how did your stuff get stolen?
So I mean, it's just, I mean, there's a lot. I don't have any great history in there. It's just there is like a tradition, like there's the traditional carries around the falls, obviously, but then also around. So like, I'm going to say the name, but there's where the water intakes are, for example, up above the falls. Like there's the old fort that was there. That's also where Mackenzie would have put in, because that was the traditional end of the carry. I mean, I wish I could say more about it, but I don't want to misspeak because I haven't done like
There's
all of
stuff
the
about
history.
Lafayette and his troops coming up and them having to circumnavigate, and that's what it made me think about, but I don't know any more than that. But
I mean, I live on Grand Island where Birdship Creek is named after the burning of the ships from, fighting between the French and British. So yeah, I wish I could say more and I did enough to research to get Mackenzie like through this area. I guess I'm sorry that I don't know tons more. Good. I thought you were going to ask something else. Oh, the stuff gets stolen. Yes. We camped in a town and did not do a good job reading the situation.
raccoons?
Oh no. It was people who had too much to drink and raided our stuff while we were sleeping. So yeah, I guess hooligans. But it was we stopped camping in towns. It turns out that afterwards, when I told that story to people, the cops came and talked, and they're like, "You didn't do anything wrong. Like, there's a real problem." And there's a lot of the issues in the First Nations up in that particular valley: alcoholism, unemployment, lack of opportunity. Everybody's got a satellite television. They can see. They see this stuff on TV all day, but they are so physically separated from it and from the opportunity to really have something to do with it unless they leave. And so it's a story in many places about, passing on traditions, and it's a hard living to be a fur trapper out on the land, right? Which is what Wilford Jackson does, but not necessarily what his children are interested in, or grandchildren are interested in.
I have a geography water question, because I went to this thing about the Great Lakes, and how the Great Lakes flow east.
Yep.
Where does it change and it flows north?
Oh yeah. So that's I should have said, but that's what was so fascinating about what, like Peter Pond, I said he was the first white man to cross the Methi Portage. The Methi Portage, I wish. So the Methi Portage is in, I don't know, it's in here somewhere. But essentially, like, it's where the watershed stops being Hudson Bay and starts to be in the north. So what the Mackenzie actually drains, or the Dead Show actually drains, is all the way down into British Columbia, Alberta, the Peace River, where's the Peace River? Peace River's in here, etc. So like, it's this massive chunk.
Isn't it the Continental Divide that separates?
It is, but there's a number of divides. Like the Continental is obviously the east-west, but there's also like a north-east of when things go into the Arctic versus when they go into Hudson's Bay.
Because we have concerns about our water protecting it from the way it flows into us. So that's what I'm curious about, is like, where's it coming from? That was just my thought. I went to water people in this area, so.
I mean, and Pond knew he got there because he was going upstream, carried the boat. Oh, I'm going downstream. And I'm going downstream north. And like, it's when you're on the land, like he was able to tell what was happening, even if he was the one mapping it for the first time.
So, is this the Yukon is like west of the Mackenzie, or it's just the?
Yeah, so
I can see that the Skitin from Wrangell is a feeder of the Yukon, I think, and it's just.
Yeah, so the Yukon is on the other side of the Rockies and the other side of.
Okay.
So you have to go. I mean,
yeah.
So the Yukon is going to be draining the very, very northern British Columbia, Yukon Territory, obviously through Alaska, but it's on the other side of the mountains. Again.
Do you know where it comes out?
The Yukon?
Yeah.
Yeah, all the way in western Alaska. Yeah, so it's flowing west. I mean, again, not to talk about a book that I'm not talking about, but because of I can tell you because of the Klondike Gold Rush book, that some people, people try to get to the Klondike many ways. Like the traditional route is the one I said. You would go up to Skagway, you would cross over, you would take the Yukon River down into the Klondike there. I don't have it great on this map. Some people though tried to take the Mackenzie River, and they went to a certain point and then tried to cross the mountains and come back down. And that is how the first fur traders got there. It is not the most direct route, because there is no, those mountains just go and go and go and separate the two. Yes?
As a writer, how did you make this transition from defusing bombs and that sort of thing to canoeing?
Life.
That's part of it. I had written about a bunch of stuff. I was fortunate that I wrote about the outdoors for Adirondack Explorer and Adirondack Life, and I'd done smaller things. It's not that I'd never written about the outdoors again. Really, the short answer is I'm very, very fortunate that my editor at Doubleday liked my previous stuff, and when I pitched this, he listened to it instead of just dismissing it out of hand, and was a great advocate for me within Doubleday to say, hey, I know Brian's our bomb guy, but I think he can do this other thing too. So yeah, I can try to do this other thing as well. I think that's the practical. I had the transition from being a bomb guy to writing was really, I was in the military, I had done that, I became a contractor afterwards, I did a lot of explosive work as a contractor. Full honesty, had essentially a mental breakdown and needed all of the post-traumatic stress and everything else. And that's when I said, I'd always wanted to be a writer since I was a little kid. I didn't know writers. Like I said, I grew up in Chipewyan and I don't know, these were not the people that I had met were writers. And I said, well, finally, I've taken my experience, I've taken this bomb thing as far as it can go. The thing I want to do is I think I have a story I want to write about. I think I've always wanted to write a book. I think now I have something worth writing, and I'm just really fortunate about what happened. Some people have raised their hands, and I haven't. Let's go in the front. I just want to get to everybody.
Just a curiosity. How would you compare what we just saw to the Finger Lakes, the Great Lakes?
I missed the last word. I'm sorry.
Great Lakes, the Finger Lakes.
How do you compare this to those?
What you did, yeah.
Yeah, so comparing this to the Great Lakes and the Finger Lakes, I think that the similarity is that because the Mackenzie River is so big and so wide, that the wind is really the biggest issue. And so just like on Lake Erie, where whitecaps and the wind are the problem, it often is there as well. It's also true that because the river is moving against the wind, that you have a lot of it's very good for that whitecap formation. But having the current is a really big help. So I think it's, yeah, I mean, the scale of the water sometimes feels similar. I mean, certainly when you're on Great Slave Lake, because we spent the first 2 days doing, the shore of Great Slave Lake. I mean, that feels very similar. Yes?
Was there any specific moments in nature that was just sent to your soul? I'm sure there's many, but is there any days that you can relate to that you could share with us?
That was an interesting and unexpected part of the experience. And by that I mean, I was expecting to have more nature talking to my soul. And it didn't feel like that. It felt exhausting. And so, and I spent a lot of time thinking about why that was. And I was reading Sigurd Olson. I don't know if anybody else has read Sigurd Olson. He's wrote in the 60s, Minnesotan, did a lot of boundary water stuff, but then also like the Churchill River and stuff. And he always talks about he's one of these guys about how refreshing it is to be out in nature and scrubbing your soul clean, and at the end of the long day is when it feels the most, whatever else. And I was reading that while I was on the trip, and I was not having that experience. And I think there's a couple of reasons. I showed you that picture of Campbell Bend, the mountains and whatever else. That was really the prettiest section. 99% of the Mackenzie looks like this. It is 1 trillion black spruce trees. It's every black spruce tree in the world. And you see one after another, and it's kind of like paddle to the point, paddle to the point, paddle to the point, paddle to the point. How long have we been going? Singing to yourself. Just, I was doing, 40 strokes a minute, 12 hours a day, 40 days on the water, and it felt exhausting.
You're describing misery.
Yes, it is. It's misery and suffering, and I'm waiting for enlightenment, and I think that, I think part of the reason why this is one of the reasons I came up with. I think that I don't know about your experience, and I don't want to speak for anyone in here and what they've done and places they've been. I mean, the Grand Canyon is not like this. The Grand Canyon is. We did 21 days. It is spectacular from start to finish, right? It's incredible. This is not the Grand Canyon. And there are places that we preserve as national parks and state parks because they're beautiful, they're unique, there's some great view, whatever else. There's a lot of in-between places. And we drive those or fly those in-between places very quickly. And the Mackenzie, the Detroit River, is like a lot of in-between places. And if you had to paddle, I don't know, Interstate 90 across New York State, it might not, I don't know, there's a lot of in-between places. I love a lot of that farmland, but it did feel like you've seen it. This is, a lot of it is like this. And so it's just a different experience. It was like an endurance experience. It was an exhaustion experience. It was misery. I don't know, I still struggle to like, I feel like I should have found some zen or gratitude or something out of it. But like instead, I mean, when I was done, when we got to the end, I ate a Snickers bar and I cried. I was done.
Your soul was crushed.
Yeah.
I was thinking the night sky would be just expansive and show everything, but are you like?
So we did it in the summer. There was no darkness.
Okay.
So another part of this is there's just no, like, it's hard to sleep, and it's never dark. And I mean, one of the things I never used was a headlamp. 22 hours of sunlight, and then you get like pink for 2 hours. Yes.
My question may have been answered in your just recent answer, but is there any part of it that you would do again?
So part of it I would do again. So the delta is exquisite because the delta goes from like as wide as the Mississippi, and the scale is completely insane and I can't comprehend it, to like in some places in the delta, the best way through is a creek as wide as this, as this lectern, right? And you're like skirting through places and like pulling through willow bushes and whatever. And then in the, just as kind of like a quirk of ecology, the boreal forest follows the Mackenzie all the way up until the very, 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 very end. And like then the last 5 islands are tundra. And the tundra is like, I don't know, it feels so good at the end. It's like, it smells good. Like there's like flowers and blueberries and bees. And like Senny, who I was with, he said like, and the ground is soft, and we like slept on the moss, and he's like, it's like he said, it feels like I put a mattress down in a soap aisle. Like, you know, like the way it smelled, and like, it's just amazing. I would do the tundra again. The tundra was incredible. In the back,
You
yes,
have
sir.
a really bad weather day.
Yeah, I mean, we got caught on, the thunderstorms follow, because it's 95 degrees and continuous sunshine. So it's just constantly building thunderheads. And the rain, just because of the way the winds work, the thunderheads follow you on the river. So once you're caught in a thunderstorm, I mean, it can take a half hour to get off the water if you're not watching and you're in the middle of the river and you need to get off or whatever. So we got caught in lightning storms bad. We got grounded in a couple days of wind where we could not move. And I thought the tent was going to be torn. It snowed and sleeted at the end. We had some good weather. I guess we had all the weather. Like we had all of the things. In 40 days, we have everything in various times.
When you say we, is it just you and one of your buddies?
One at a time, yeah.
And
two of
the
us.
two of you slept in that tent? Or-
Yep. Yep, and all of our...
How long was that canoe?
18 and a half feet. I mean, we had, with the canoe barrels that you can see in the middle, like
Is
we
that
had...
a bear canister?
Yeah, I mean, we had all of our dinners and all of our breakfasts, and then we're trying to buy food in towns, which, I mean, we didn't run out of food, but at the end we had 2 days of food. So if we got stuck on Gary Island, we were going to have to stretch it for a little while.
Pemmican is dried meat.
Pemmican is dried bison combined with cranberries, hair, and poop. Now, that's the traditional recipe. The modern recipe skips the poop, but maybe not the hair. I mean, it had those things in there as binders, like to keep it from falling apart.
So, sorry. I was going to say, we'll do one more question.
Okay. One more, and then you have to catch me with a beer.
I'm just curious about the quality of man, this Mackenzie, and what, you described this really harrowing experience. I'm kind of curious about how he felt, how he kept going. You've named the book, Disappointment River. I'm kind of interested in how the process had. And in just
Yeah, so a little bit more about Mackenzie himself. I mean, he was ambitious. He concocted, him being the replacement for Pond to go on the trip. He sent his cousin to one of the great meetups, business meetings on his behalf to lobby everyone to make sure he was the one that could do it, and that his cousin would then like backfill for him. Like Mackenzie was like trying to pull strings. So he had ambition. He describes himself as like unflappable, full of stamina. These hunters, they're lazy. Gina's complaining that we're moving too fast. Like, Mackenzie didn't paddle. Like, he sat there and wrote. Like, his job was to write. Actually, he had a clerk to write for him. So, like, and some of his journal entries are like 2 lines. So I'm not really sure what he was doing all day sometimes, especially if it's gray and he can't take a reading with his sextant or something, and he can't measure the height of the sun above the horizon and all that. Like, what are you doing all day? There was a division of labor, not just among men and women, but also between the voyageurs and the bourgeoisie, and he was definitely bourgeoisie. I mean, he was personally set up in the business with the Lord Bannerman and all those kind of things. So like, there was a certain amount of entitlement, and when he decided that he was a failure, like, he goes back to Montreal, he runs for Parliament, in Canadian Parliament, what's now the Canadian Parliament, but the colonial government. He wins, but he never shows up. Like, doesn't bother going. They have this. The way I end the book is I talk about the Beaver Club. So there was in Montreal, there was what they called the Beaver Club, which was all of the traders, either the retired traders when they were all done, or people like back, after they had done 2 years or whatever in the interior, and then they would come in and they would go back and forth, and they would get together every 2 weeks over the winter at the bar or the Beaver Club, and they would have a big meal, and they'd get really drunk, and then they would push all the tables together, and then they would pretend that they were in canoes running the rapids. They would like throw chairs at each other and scream and yell and pretend to be in it. And I have to tell you, as a military veteran, it's like, I've been to this party. I know what this feels like, telling war stories. And it's both nostalgia and it's a little sad. And Mackenzie was the big drinker. He was the king of cups. He was the life of the party until, he drank himself to death. So it's, yeah, I guess I don't know. I understand the trajectory a little bit. Okay, we're going to do one last question, then we're all done.
Did they do any kind of collections of specimens of plants and so forth? Was there a scientific element in any of it?
It was a business venture, and I mean, you can see that at the Beaver Club as well. Actually, and there is a restaurant called the Beaver Club in some posh Montreal hotel that has nothing to do with the actual thing, but if you need to go and experience that, you can do that in Montreal. Okay, we're going to call it there. Thank you for all of the questions.
I just want to thank Brian again for coming, speaking about his book. Thank you so much for coming. I've read his book and I love it. He reads the audiobook and I think he does an excellent job.
How do we buy the book?
You can buy free.
Right up. Cash, check, Venmo, PayPal. I'm sorry I don't have one of those squares.
Do we have one of them too?
I don't know. Okay.
I know.
Yeah, I think that's the conclusion. It's money set aside and that was great.